Us. This is after a teacher who was assaulted by a pupil was awarded £150,000 compensation. The teacher, who worked at a school for boys with behavioural issues in Wales, was left with injuries to his face, mouth and head after he was punched and headbutted. School leaders in England have described a culture of non-compliance among pupils, with behaviour reportedly worse since COVID. And now a new survey has revealed that nearly 1 in 5 teachers has been hit by a pupil this year. Joining me now in the studio is author and former teacher Frances Gilbert, and down the line I'm joined by Gráinne Hanahan, a journalist and the head of community at TeacherTapp, which is a daily survey app for teachers. Why don't I start with you, Gráinne, just because you're kind of a slightly more at the cold face. I know that Frances is busily teaching undergraduates, partly to be teachers. So tell me what's happened since COVID. Why has violence against teachers increased? You might have thought that pupils would be so delighted to be back at school, they'd be extra delightful and bring an apple for the teacher rather than being violent.
It's a really hard thing to talk about, isn't it? Because I think even if you were in the room while a violent incident happened, you wouldn't be able to say with 100% certainty, oh, this has happened because of this, this and this. So what we can do is sort of talk about what we do know about what's changed in classrooms. So we do know that the funding cuts and the thresholds of families to receive help are higher now than they've been in previous years. And as a consequence of that, there are fewer adults working in schools and fewer agency staffs working with the schools to support those students who've got more challenging behaviour. So we know that's what's happening. We also know that during lockdown, the way that children socialised completely changed. So they were doing far more online socialisation and they weren't being able to meet up and interact face to face. And we're hearing from experts that since lockdown's been lifted and things have gone back to normal, that sort of going down to the park and playing football with your mates isn't happening in the same way as it was before the pandemic. And are more likely to go to organised activities, but they're not so likely to go out and interact of their own accord, on their own, without being prompted to do it. So this is possibly contributing to the behaviour that we're seeing in schools, but it's really difficult to say this is definitely the problem because, of course, there's so many different things that are happening outside of the school gates that schools don't control that could be contributing to it.
And at TeacherTapp, this daily survey app for teachers, is this one of the big topics? Is this one of the things that's being addressed as a regular occurrence?
Yes, so it's something that we get a lot of feedback about, and teachers are really keen to talk about their experiences in school. When it comes to behaviour, it's a very difficult thing to say that, all right, in my class, it's a problem, because teaching is such a personal thing. So being able to talk about it on the app and being able to talk about what's happening, what they're seeing like that week, that day, is really useful for teachers. And we ask them about, this week, what have you seen in your schools and in your... And this is a question that we ask again and again and again. And we can see that compared to 2 years ago, more teachers are saying they've seen pupils fighting. More teachers are saying they've seen pushing and shoving. More teachers have seen students getting their phones out when phones are meant to be banned. So that's increased just over 2 years, and that's after the lockdown. So it's not just a, lockdown happened, things are getting better now, like this is going to be on a trajectory going like behaviour getting better and incidents going down. We can see it's far more complicated than that.
And I'm going to ask you one more question before I bring in Frances. Sanctions. What are teachers allowed to do to prevent pupils being violent, disruptive, acting up, causing trouble? What's open to them to do?
So in secondary schools, we can see that teachers give out detentions. This is something we actually asked about just last week. We talked about what happened in your class and how many detentions did you give out. So teachers in secondary schools use detentions. Teachers in primary schools don't use that sanction. They might take break time away, but they don't call it a detention like teachers in secondary schools do. You can talk to parents. You can sanction by doing what we call a fixed term exclusion, where they're taken out of lessons. That's quite a serious sanction. But most of the time, sanctions are reprimands. You might have demerits. You might have an internal exclusion room where students are taken out of lessons and spoken to separately, and that sort of intervention. But yeah, that in terms of sanctions, that's really like your repertoire. When it comes to getting involved in a violent incident, as a teacher, you've got to be, of course, really aware of your safety, your own protection. And teachers know never to be alone with the pupil. It's a very difficult area when students have to have their rights observed. You don't want to to intervene in a fight and end up hurting a student, but at the same time keeping yourself and the other students that are in your care safe.
Yes, it is very difficult. Let's talk to Frances Guild about this. So do we attribute it to lockdown? Do we attribute it to social situations outside school, or do we think that teachers are less able to keep control? And does it really matter what's causing it when it's obviously a serious problem that's getting worse, more problematic?
Well, I would like to reassure parents who are watching this, because I started my career in the 1990s. I think overall behaviour's got a lot better since I started teaching. I mean, as a young teacher in the 1990s, I was hit, I had pins thrown at me, I was, systematically treated with violence. And in a way, it was seen as kind of not normal, but just get on with the job. And I think now there is much more of a zero tolerance. I've been in and out of schools for the last 10 years as a teacher educator at Goldsmiths, and the behaviour I've observed there in some of the most difficult schools in the whole of the country is very, very good, and teachers are doing a good job. That said, I do agree a lot with what Grania is saying. I think she's really on the nail. I think the cutbacks in resourcing around teaching and the teacher-staff ratio, teacher-pupil ratio does affect things. So that means you've got more pupils for one teacher, and that obviously causes problems. I also would add into the mix, I think some of the curriculum at the moment, particularly in the secondary sector, is very, very moribund and not engaging for students.
I'm moribund, you mean half dead. So what you're saying is what the curriculum is boring, is that what you're saying?
It's boring.
Give a few examples of boring curriculum.
It's very much, teachers are forced to teach to the test, and it's very exam orientated. So children are often sitting doing mock exams in class, and that is a recipe for misbehaviour, because often pupils with all the problems that are going on don't quite know what to do, and they misbehave because it is just a boring setup. And I think that schools need to be given more freedom to teach much more creatively and have more things like music and drama and sports, so that children are allowed to be children. I think that that's been a serious problem.
But of course there's colossal audit every 5 minutes. There's Ofsted bearing down on schools. There's teachers knowing that they have to deliver a certain standard. There's pressure from parents. There's pressure on children, pressure on teachers. And the idea that they should bring in a big brass band and do a bit of tap dancing to liven things up so they don't feel like picking up a chair and hitting the teacher over the head with it, that's not the thing, is it? The thing is to get children reading, writing and doing arithmetic and passing a few exams so the school gets a decent rating.
I mean, you're parodying what I'm saying.
I'm not really.
I think you are. I think that we have cut back massively on creative education for our young people, and they've massively suffered. They don't do the music they used to do. They don't do the drama they used to do. They don't do the sports they used to do. And those are all the things that really bring human culture alive. And I think that at the moment there's too many schools that are exam factories that are forcing children to take exams they don't understand why they're taking. And I think we need to have a rethink and actually start to think of making a curriculum that actually engages children much more creatively.
And one of the things that you do, Frances, is you teach teachers to teach. So what do you teach them about eruptions of violence in the classroom, or disruptive behaviour, or, pernicious use of the phone when phones are supposed to be banned, or all the things that Grania's just mentioned? Because it's incredibly difficult, isn't it, to teach a mixed ability group anyway. Very difficult to teach a group of disaffected kids who aren't very interested in the subject, as you say. Very difficult to teach children who haven't had breakfast or haven't had a stable bedtime, who come to school in a state of kind of nervous adrenaline flux and can't concentrate anyway. And you've got all of that going on in one classroom, and then violence or disruption occurs. It's absolutely a nightmare. And as Grania quite rightly says, these days you can't do what they used to do when I was at school, to take the child, clip it round the ear roll, grab it by the...
Which makes it worse, of course.
Yeah, of course, grab it by the hair and shove it in the the naughty cup, but you can't do any of that.
You and I were for that generation.
Exactly. So what do you teach? What do you teach children teachers to do?
We teach teachers to be very firm and have what you might call tough love, and take a kind of mindful, calm approach. So we do practice things like breathing techniques, so that the teacher themselves is the centre of calm, and they are very clear about what their boundaries are, and they're very clear about what the sanctions are. And well-run schools do this, and there are plenty of them knocking around because I've been in them recently. And you know, the children are well behaved, and they are doing lessons that really engage them, and they're really learning, and that's the focus. And if you have a teacher who's passionate about their subject, has firm boundaries, is taking a mindful, calm approach, then the class over time initially might be a bit badly behaved if they've come from a difficult situation, will calm down, and relationships will be formed which will make that class really effective.
And of course, one of the problems we hear about Grenier is you know, failure to retain teachers. It's hard enough to recruit them, but very difficult to keep people teaching. And when Francis talks about the reception that he had when he started, with pins being thrown at him and missiles that he had to duck as he arrived at work every day, and you know, general oppression that he suffered, it's quite a miracle, isn't it, that he lasted the course and now goes on to teach other teachers how to teach. So, you know, how do you, if there's an atmosphere of violence or fear of violence or disruption, persuade teachers to stay as long as Francis and learn how to deal with it? You think they might just head for the hills for their own safety, apart from anything else?
You're absolutely correct. And when we asked teachers just this week about the reasons why they last thought about, when you thought about leaving, like what was the thing that made you think about or consider leaving teaching? And one of the top answers was behaviour of students. And we know it's a reason why teachers do leave the classroom. The good news is that the longer that you teach, the better behaviour tends to be for you. So teachers that have been teaching a longer time tend to build up better relationships with the students, tend to be able to manage the behaviour in their classrooms. So they've got more skills, they've learned different tricks to get children to behave. So the longer you're in the classroom, the better you are at managing behaviour. However, the point you're making about schools have systems to deal with discipline, that's a really key point. And schools where they've got systems in place and the teacher feels confident that if they give that sanction, that they're going to be backed up by their head of department or their head teacher, that in those schools you might be faced with poor behaviour, but at least you have the confidence to go into a classroom and deal with that behaviour, knowing that you'll be supported by your senior leaders. And asking classroom teachers to go into classrooms and face poor behaviour, but not actually be supported by the teachers, the other teachers at the school, or by the parents at home, is a recipe for disaster. And that's why we have teachers leaving the classroom. Everyone expects to have a bit of misbehaviour. I mean, I think it's really important that we're talking about two different things. You have general behaviour in schools where there's a level of slight disruption, talking, you know, what we call like low-level disruption. That is to be expected to an extent. But when we're talking about violent behaviour, where pupils and teachers and people are at risk, that's completely different. And you need to have the support of your senior leaders and know that when you're teaching those students, you will be backed up by the school and by the parents.
Francis, talk to me a little bit about exclusion, because that very often can be the consequence of bad behaviour in class. But it's something that most teachers and head teachers are very keen to avoid if they possibly can.
Yeah, they are, because, of course, that has a really detrimental effect on the students, and they're out of their schooling, and the evidence is that they don't get better, you know, and they land up in what we might call pupil referral units. And so exclusion is really a last resort. What you want is an inclusive approach which engages the most disengaged students, and we need to give teachers the resources and freedom to do that.
And Grenier, as far as exclusion is concerned, do you hear much about that from your teachers? And do you get the impression that that is on the increase as people despair about what to do?
So we can look at the behaviour data and we can see that there are more exclusions that are happening since before the pandemic. But of course, during those years when we were in lockdown, exclusions couldn't take place. So there was this natural sort of bump in them and a rise in them once schools reopened again. However, I think it's really important when we talk about exclusions and alternative provisions that we don't demonise them. And actually, they do great work with children. They have brilliant outcomes for their pupils. Sometimes for students, the best thing that can happen to them is to be sent to a referral unit or to an alternative provision, because there they have the education that they need and they can have the interventions that should have taken place in mainstream. And, you know, the work that is done by teachers in those schools is brilliant. And I think it's wrong to say that it's, you know, it's always a route down for a pupil. Sometimes it's the best thing that can happen to a pupil.
And Francis, you know what you were arguing very passionately for, you know, a varied and different kind of curriculum, not the one that you described as moribund, but one with, you know, much more variety, much more creativity, much more flexibility. Is there any likelihood of that happening? For example, should the Labour Party win the general election, do you think that party might be more amenable to that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very sort of comforted by the way Starmer's been talking about bringing up much more arts-based
Well, he was a musician as a child, wasn't he? So he really
child,
cares about that.
And he's going to have a focus much more on structured talk in classes. So teachers will be encouraged to get children talking about subjects in a meaningful way. I think that, you know, giving teachers education around these areas and really boosting the funding for things like music and drama and sports in particular is going to make a massive difference, because children will start to really enjoy school when those things come into place.
Thank you both very much indeed. This is what's coming up after the break. A 19-year-old man has been arrested in connection with a stabbing on a London train.